Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Modupe Akinola, and I'm an associate professor at Columbia Business School, and I'm also the director of the Sanford C. Bernstein Company Center for Leadership and Ethics. And I just want to welcome all of you today to the annual KPMG Peat Marwick Stanley R Cleon Forum, featuring our incredibly special guest, Valerie Jarrett. Now, what is the Klion Forum? You all signed up for this Klion Forum. What is this thing? It's one of our premier speaker series at Columbia Business School, and it features prominent leaders from a variety of different industries who are committed to resolving major ethical, political, social, and economic challenges of our times. And we are so excited to have the Miss Valerie Jarrett, who is so incredible in terms of her career in law, business, public service, and political activism with us today. So that's what the Klion Forum is, but who is Stanley R. Cleon, for whom it is named? Stanley Cleon served as the executive vice chairman and chief operating partner of Peat Marwick International, which was one of the world's largest accounting and management consulting firms. And he was also a prominent executive in residence at Columbia Business School for a long period of time, from 1986 to 1999, 94 that is actually. And although Mr. Cleon is no longer with us, the Bernstein Center is so fortunate to have his family and the support of his family to continue his legacy, and they are joining us virtually today. They include his brother, Mr. Bart Cleon, his daughters, Kathy and Emily, his great nephew, Henry, Bruce, Nicole. A lot of people in the Cleon family have joined us. And so this is a reunion in some ways too. And we cannot thank the Cleon family enough for their continuous support of this forum and of the Bernstein Center. So with that, it is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce our very special guest, Miss Valerie Jarrett. And we all know her accomplishments are so long that I'm going to keep this brief so that we have time to talk to her. Ms. Jarrett is the longest serving senior advisor to President Barack Obama, and she oversaw the Office of Public Engagement and Intergovernmental Affairs and chaired the White House Council on Women and Girls. And before joining the White House, she served as the CEO of the Habitat Company in Chicago, and also chairman of the board for numerous public and private enterprises, including the Chicago Transit Board and the Chicago Stock Exchange. And as if that isn't enough, she's currently a senior advisor to the Obama Foundation and a senior distinguished fellow at the University of Chicago Law School. Oh, and as if that wasn't enough, oh yeah, she added author as another thing she did. This is her book, Finding My Voice. And if you haven't read it, please do. We'll whet your appetite a little bit by probably talking about some things she discussed in the book, but this is the Valerie Jarrett. And another way to put it is, this is the woman, the bomb, bad mama jamma, all that in a bag of chips, if we're going to go colloquial in terms of who we have with us today. So thank you, Valerie, for joining us.
You're welcome, Modupe. What an introduction that was. I am delighted to be here with you all.
Thank you, thank you. And I feel like we're going to just jump right in.
Let's do it.
And my question for you is, before you experience all those accolades and continued accolades, which you will continue to gain in your life, you are the daughter of Barbara and Jim Bowman. You're somebody's niece. You're somebody's best friend. If we were to ask them who you are, who would they say you are? What 3 words would they use to describe you?
Well, you pick people who love me, so I hope they would be 3 complimentary words. Loyal, responsible, and true. I'll go with those.
And
I'm very close to my family and friends, and so they're important to me, and so I invest in them, and goodness knows I wouldn't be where I am without their support and love.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I listened to your podcast with former FLOTUS, and she mentioned that you were one of the most honest and trustworthy people she knows. So that sounds very, very consistent.
Well, I get that from Barbara and Jimmy Bowman. I was raised well with a strong sense of purpose and moral compass and with sense of responsibility, I think. And so my parents taught me by their life's example.
Now tell me a little bit more about your parents. I know that for the first 5 years of your life, you were in Iran.
Yeah, I was born in Iran.
You were born there because your father was a doctor and couldn't find opportunities here.
Well, so let's go back in the day, in the mid-50s. We were still living under Jim Crow in the United States. And my father, who was a well-trained physician and had been in the Army practicing, when he was leaving the Army, he wanted to join a major academic teaching hospital around the country and couldn't find a job comparable to his white counterparts. And so he and my mother started looking for opportunities outside of the United States. And back then, for those of you who are not history buffs, the United States had very strong diplomatic ties with Iran. The Shah of Iran was a very close partner to the United States in a whole range of issues. And he was interested in improving healthcare in the country and had instructed his team to create hospitals in underserved parts of the country. And so my dad was offered the opportunity to help start a new hospital in Shiraz, Iran, the Namazi Hospital, and chair the Department of Pathology, an opportunity that was not available to him in the United States. And so off they went. And the irony of the story, or I guess maybe the moral of the story, is that we started doing research, unusual research, which we won't go into here, that caught the attention of folks at the Galton Labs at University College of London. So after 5 years in Iran, he and my mother got a little homesick and started to think, well, let's start heading back to the United States. And from the Galton Labs, he delivered a paper, and it caught the attention of the dean of the University of Chicago Medical Center. My mom grew up in Chicago. My dad had done his residency in Chicago, and he became the first African-American tenured professor in the Division of Biological Sciences at the University of Chicago. And so his message to me growing up was sometimes the shortest distance to where you really want to go means you better be flexible and take the scenic route.
Absolutely. Now it sounds like, or from what you said, you've had international experiences at a young age, and then living in Iran, then living in England for a bit, then moving to Chicago. Tell us a little bit more about what that transition was like and how that might have inspired you or shaped your goal of fairness and having a just society and being able to promote that in your life's work.
Well, initially, to be very candid with you, it was hard for me. I'm age 5. I'm speaking 3 languages because we lived on a hospital compound in Shiraz with families of physicians from all over the world. So I was speaking French and English and Farsi. The 1 year in Great Britain, I developed a British accent. And then I get plopped down in the neighborhood public school, and I was different. And all I wanted to be was just like all the other kids. And during summer vacations, my father continued his research that he'd begun in Iran, and he was a pathologist and a hematologist and a geneticist. And so we would go through Africa as he was studying diseases that were genetically based and varied depending upon geography. And so everybody else was going to summer camp, and I'm going from Ghana to Nigeria to Uganda to Ethiopia to Egypt, and then we'd circle back through Iran. He continued to consult for a long time. And so I became really shy. And I think it was as a result of feeling different. And I know a lot of people when they're young feel different, and it manifests itself in interesting ways. But as an adult now, what I realized, I learned 3 lessons as a result of that experience. And one is, I honestly think I can walk into a room and find something in common with whoever's in that room. Yeah. And that's come in handy, having had to work with some very strange bedfellows in my life. And I think it comes from having grown up with children from all over and seeing that we're still kids and we could find that common ground, even when language was a barrier. Yeah. The other lesson I learned is that living outside of the United States in a country that was underdeveloped gives you an appreciation for the United States that many Americans take for granted. And it's everything from the clean water and the food and we're not worrying about diseases for which there were not cures, to our civil liberties and freedom of speech and association and religion and a democracy is different than when you're under the rule of a shah. And then the final thing I think I learned, which came in handy throughout my life, but certainly those 8 years in the White House, is that the United States is an extraordinary country. We know that. It's actually not the only country on earth. And we have a lot to learn outside of our shores. And I think seeing the United States from outside and appreciating the fact that there is a big world out there helped me, sorry, my dog's going crazy, helped me situate the United States, I think, in a better way. So those are some of the lessons I learned.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary experience and a unique background. I mean, very few people have had that type of background. And likewise, if you think statistically, there's really a less than 1% chance that you would have ended up where you are today, just based on just your background, your race, your gender, you name it. At what point in your life did you realize that you were going to be in that 1%? Could you
my goodness,
that point or that moment or whatever it was that made you think, oh my goodness, I might be in that 1%?
I think, honestly, sitting on that platform inauguration day back in 2009 with my daughter, who was in law school at the time, freezing cold. And I thought, I can't believe we're actually here and that we're about to embark on this extraordinary privilege, this extraordinary journey. And I remember sitting there thinking, I just can't believe this is my life. I'm used to seeing other people sitting up on the platform on inauguration day, and then there I was. So it took me a while for it to actually sink in. But boy, what an extraordinary ride it has been. But I will say that I think all the chapters leading up to that, when you look back, it makes a lot more sense than it did at the time when I was making these life-turning decisions.
Right. Well, you know, they say luck favors the prepared, and you talked about how your father was prepared in some ways and also got a little bit lucky. I'm curious to hear more about ways in which you felt you were prepared to take on the roles that you have taken on in your journey, and in what ways luck might have played a role too.
Well, so let's go back. When I finished law school, I really didn't have any idea what I wanted to do. I didn't have any idea why I went to law school, to be very candid with you. My best friend was a couple years older than I, and she said, go to law school, buy you some time. And it seemed like a good idea to me. And my parents, who were both academics, believed in continuing education and going as far as you could. And when I finished law school, I thought, well, let me make a plan, right? Everybody seemed to have had a plan, and I made one up, which was to discover my passion in the law, fall in love, get married, have a baby by the time I was 30, thinking about the biological clock ticking away, and live happily ever after. And I, in fact, begin my book 10 years into that 10-year plan, sitting in my office, having landed a job at a great law firm, married the boy next door, had a baby at 29, and I was completely miserable. And so misery motivated me to make what turned out in retrospect to be a life-changing swerve.
Yeah.
And I decided I had to do something. I wasn't meant to be that miserable. And a dear friend of mine said, why don't you consider public service?
Mm-hmm.
You'll feel like you're a part of something bigger than yourself. And Mayor Harold Washington, who was the first Black mayor of Chicago, had just been reelected to his second term. And that was not on my 10-year plan. And I told my friend, but no, this is my plan. He said, but your plan is making you miserable. Switch. And I did. And I never looked back. And I think many of the lessons that I learned in local government in Chicago, Modupe prepared me for going on and running my own company, serving on a range of boards, and ultimately being a senior advisor to the president. First of all, I learned to listen. And I think when your constituents are proximate, and when you're in local government, let me tell you, you can't get away from your constituents. They're your next door neighbors. They have your phone number. They stop you at the grocery store, the dry cleaners, take my daughter to the park, and people would come up to me and lobby me. And that's as it should be. And I think it teaches you that it's 24/7. I developed a much tougher skin in local government. You know, first time the newspaper said something critical about me, I was devastated. And I remember the mayor saying, well, if you don't like it, go to the editorial board and complain. And I said, we get to do that? And he says, yes, march over there and complain. I will. And so I think those experiences, in a sense, taught me that you're there to serve the people who put their trust in you. And I also, one of the jobs I had was Commissioner of Planning and Development, and looking at the urban landscape and trying to work with people to improve their lives and develop neighborhoods in Chicago that hadn't been developed before, historically neglected. And when I went to the White House, a couple of my responsibilities were, as you mentioned, the Office of Public Engagement, which was the gateway into the White House for the American people. And I'd done that at the local level. And then the other was overseeing intergovernmental affairs. And I'd worked for mayors. I'd been chairing the board of the Chicago Transit Authority, which is a regional operation. I appreciated the importance of those local elected officials and wanted to be their gateway. And then finally, chairing the White House Council on Women and Girls, having been a single mom who had good paying jobs, health insurance, supportive parents, steady childcare, excellent childcare, flexibility. Once I left the law firm, I worked enormously long hours in the city, but all of my bosses recognized I was a single mother and gave me support. And I still felt like I was hanging on by my fingertips. And so I used to think, well, what must life be like for those working moms who have none of that, who have no safety net? And that's when I really started on my journey for gender equity. And so chairing the White House Council on Women and Girls was like a lived experience from my perspective. So I think the key is to be open, to be flexible, to recognize that opportunity never knocks at opportune moments. And that when you look back on your life, the chapters tend to add up if you're willing to take some calculated risks and change paths and find your own passion and listen to the quiet voice inside of you, which I think I ignored initially.
So for all of you out there, whether you're MBAs or law school students or working and you're feeling unhappy and wondering what your path should be and have that 10-year plan, what I've heard is maybe think about ripping that up, think about your networks and relationships and tap into those to figure out what's best for you. Because if you do that, look, I mean, you have the potential to do great things. I do want to transition a little bit and talk about your experience at the White House. I so many places to begin, but I think I will start with what were the major obstacles that you and the Obama administration had to overcome to really improve societal and business issues when you were in the White House? What were your, I would say, two areas that you were like, this is what we want to tackle, we need to do it now?
Well, keep in mind back in 2009 when President Obama took office, our major banks were on the verge of collapse. The automobile industry was in bankruptcy. We had 2 wars going on. We had a very robust affirmative agenda that President Obama had committed to fulfill when he was in the campaign. So we had the headwinds of really a global economic crisis, as well as war, and trying to push forward ways of shoring up our economy, stabilizing it, creating jobs, and also committing to do robust big things such as the Affordable Care Act. And I think the headwinds that surprised me in a profoundly disappointing way that have only gotten worse over the last 4 years is that there is a toxicity in the air in Washington that I just wasn't prepared for. And I say that coming from Chicago, which is known for having rough and tumble politics. That's what Chicago is, one of our reputations. But I always felt that in the end, people might disagree about how to get where they wanted to go, but they did want to improve the lives of the residents of Chicago. And I think what I discovered in Washington is that so many of those politicians were too far removed from their constituents. Mm-hmm. They needed to go back home and listen the way I had learned to do. And they were prepared to basically like just hold their breath and turn purple for political short-term victories, as opposed to making big decisions for the long term for our country. And whether it was investing in infrastructure, which traditionally had been bipartisan, or supporting the Affordable Care Act that was modeled after what Governor Romney had done in Massachusetts, a Republican governor. It was not that controversial. Or everything we really tried to do was responded to through a political lens. And that was really the headwind that I had not fully appreciated. And I think it did a disservice to our country. But notwithstanding all of that, we cut the unemployment rate in half. We created millions of jobs. There are 20 million people who have healthcare coverage, not to mention 100 million Americans over who have pre-existing conditions who don't have to worry anymore. Brought home 150,000 troops. I mean, there's so much about what we did, keeping Iran from developing nuclear weapons, major climate deal. And it pains me to say all of that because the current administration is obviously trying to unravel every bit of that progress, which is why elections have consequences. And I think one of the other disappointments I had was kind of the apathy that we did see around the country. In 2016, 100 million eligible voters didn't participate. And in the presidential election, and I believe every election is important, whether it's mayor or local prosecutor, the governors, the checks and balances in Congress. And that level of disengagement, I think, from the American people also made it harder to put pressure on Congress to do the right thing.
I mean, you just mentioned the need to vote, and yes, we are in an election year. What do you think we need to do to make sure to get those numbers up again?
Well, it's interesting you'd ask that question because one of the organizations that I chair the board of now is called When We All Vote. And it was launched by former First Lady Michelle Obama a couple of years ago. And that 100 million number that didn't vote really stuck in her craw. And she's talked about this quite publicly. And so she thought, well, what can we do to change the culture in our country around voting so that people appreciate that our most basic responsibility as citizens is to ensure that we are supporting the foundation of our democracy, which is voting. That's embedded. We the people, the beginning of our Constitution, is there for a reason. It's about us. It's not about them. And if we don't provide that check and balance, how do we hold our elected officials accountable? And so we created a 501c3, not-for-profit, nonpartisan by design organization to try to close both the age and the race gap. Disproportionately young people don't vote, but they have the most to lose. And we know that there are many examples around the country where people of color, their vote has been suppressed. And so we really went at it from that perspective to try to ensure that we get as many people registered and meet people where they are, using influencers. Just this last week, ABC had a special with a whole host of comedians just talking about voting and saying why it's important. And the final point I'd make on this is that in this really painful year where we've been dealing with both the COVID-19 pandemic as well as the racial injustices that have bubbled up and really hit America as a whole, for the first time, all 50 states have had people demonstrating of all backgrounds, of all races, of all ages, mostly peaceful, which I think is a really important part of the democratic process. But it's also laid bare how important government is to both our lives and our livelihoods. And you see the difference in a state like New York that was ground zero to the pandemic that has really now gotten it down to a manageable level compared to other states where we have, it's going out of proportion, and it's the elected officials and their ability to use science as a foundation and not turn a pandemic into a political issue. And I think it's a good example of how there are no ends to which people will not go to make things about politics. And this should be about our livelihood. It shouldn't be a red state or a blue state issue. This is truly an American problem. Racial injustice, it's an American problem. And so I'm hoping that the last 4 years, and particularly this painful year, has been kind of a wake-up call. And the midterm elections were a good sign. There are more women now who are elected to Congress than ever before in our history. And no offense to the guys, but I do think we make better decisions when half the population is represented in Congress. And so I am encouraged. I'm feeling hopeful and more optimistic than perhaps if you just look at what's in the press, you might feel. And it comes from having seen the energy that's coming from the ground, where I was just on a call last night with thousands of high school students who are out there registering people to vote. And I started with a group maybe 3 months ago, and there were 30 of them. And it's just mushroomed across the country. So there are glimmers of hope.
I mean, we have hundreds of people who are here watching this. And what is one thing that you would tell all of us we need to do? I mean, you said help people register to vote. That's one avenue. Is there any, what else do you think, just so we can make sure that we're all action oriented?
Well, I want you to be an educated voter too. I want you to think about, well, what are the issues you care about most? And what are your core values? And who are the people who you think who are actually in the contest? Not talk about people who aren't actually in the races, and I'm talking about at all levels of government. Who are the people who you think both best reflect your values and your agenda and your priorities? And then get out there and vote for them and encourage your friends to vote and participate. And then once they're elected, whether your candidate wins or not, you should be holding them accountable. And there are lots of different ways of doing that. And I think, in a sense, we've seen just in the course of the summer, cities that have changed their laws because of the demonstrations, whether it's the no-knock warrant or the chokehold or taking a look at their use of force. There has been a consequence to that, in that action. That peaceful demonstrations have moved politicians. And so that's part of the civics lesson too, is that our voices matter. And so make sure that you aren't abdicating your responsibility, because one of the other lessons I learned in Washington is that there is, first of all, an entrenched stranglehold over the status quo. People who have power have no intention of giving it up unless they have to. Special interest groups that use their muscle through money in politics, they're getting their agenda. So don't you want to get your agenda through? And you don't have to spend a lot of money. You just have to fill out a ballot and vote. And our elections are always close in this country, the federal elections. And so every vote does matter. And so please vote.
You heard her. Please vote. Please tell your friends to vote. Do all this stuff. I do want to talk for a moment about the systemic racism that we're seeing or that exists, that is pervasive in the country. And in your book, one of my favorite moments was when you mentioned that President Obama used to say that every safe has a combination. You just have to figure it out. And you even gave a visual, and I could imagine him like doing the little twisty thing or whatever. This is a layup question for you. That's a joke. What do you think the combination is for addressing this systemic racism in the country and in organizations that we're seeing?
Well, I think I would go back to my early days at City Hall. We have to listen. I think, and that is happening. I have had so many people over the course of this last summer, business leaders, elected officials, say to me, I had no idea it was this bad. There was just something, I think, about the confluence of the pandemic, people being isolated, the toxicity in our political discourse, the polarization of our society, coupled with watching George Floyd die in the most callous, brutal way for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And then Breonna Taylor shot in her own home. I mean, people were really jarred by that. And I think you might say, well, when Trayvon Martin was killed, or when Eric Gardner, also somebody who in New York who had a policeman press on his neck till he was killed, or Michael Brown, or Laquan McDonald, or Tamir Rice. Unfortunately, the list just goes on and on. What was so unique about this moment? And that's why I think in the context of our current climate, it just boiled over. But I had somebody say to me recently, what is this talk that happens in the Black families? And I said, well, we teach our sons and now our daughters that they have to act a certain way when they're with police in ways that their white friends don't. And he said, how do I not know about this? And I realized, because as a Black community, we don't talk about the talk, right? Why? It's embarrassing. Why should we have to say we have to raise our children differently?
Yep.
And so I think part of how we make progress is through empathy, where people walk in our shoes and try to imagine what it's like for a Black mom or dad to worry literally every time your child leaves the house, whether or not the people who swear to protect them and serve will do that in a just and fair way. It's exhausting. And I think that what's happening in the police force is a microcosm of society.
Yes.
This is not just the police department. This is a societal problem. And I think the good news is that I think businesses are thinking, what are we doing? What's our role in this? Are we creating, we might say diversity is a strength and it gives us a competitive advantage, but are we building an inclusive culture?
Mm-hmm.
And I have heard a lot of business leaders challenging themselves on that. Why is it when we look around our boardroom or our senior management, we only see people who look like us?
Yeah.
Because you hired them. And you hired the people you know and who shared your life experiences. But the mounting evidence is showing that you will make a better decision if you're competing in a marketplace that's diverse, if you are informed by the marketplace, by your business colleagues who look like the marketplace. And so we don't have to do this because it's the nice thing to do. We can do it because of the business imperative. And I have found more and more business leaders saying, we are ill-equipped to deal with this, so we better start listening. And there is a humbleness that I think is healthy and an empathy that is growing.
Yes. And that's what makes it feel like this time is different. But I just hope that the momentum really does continue and that it's not just a punctuated moment, but one that has continued to.
Exactly. And I interviewed Dolores Huerta, who was one of the leaders of the Farm Workers Union, created it with Cesar Chavez years ago. And I interviewed her a few days ago, and she reminded me that the strike lasted 5 years. That's how long we went without having grapes in my household, 5 years. Yeah. When you think about Rosa Parks, the Montgomery Bus Boycott lasted over a year through a very hot summer in the South, where people carpooled or they walked to work. You have to be prepared to sacrifice. And I worry that in this time where everything happens so quickly, thanks to technology, that our expectations are that culture changes rapidly. And it doesn't, it takes forever. I mean, if you think about, like, we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of a woman's right to vote, white women's right to vote in this country, but the initial petition for universal suffrage was signed back in 1866, 53 years until they actually had the right to vote introduced into Congress. And for Black women, it wasn't until 1965. And so the arc has always bent slowly towards justice with effort, but slowly. And so I want people to recognize that it has to be sustained. The difference between a moment and a movement is effort and time and energy. And I'm hopeful that this time will be different.
Thank you for reminding us all of patience, which is really important. And I love also that you said that one of the ways to get this started is by listening, because we always want to act, but no, it's a moment to listen, and then with patience, hopefully rewards will come. I know we had moved to it, this was a heavy topic, so I do have a lighter question, which is, can you share a couple of pinch me moments from your time in the administration?
There are so many. I have a whole chapter in my book on pinch me moments, but you know what? The one I think every single day when I would drive through the gates of the White House, I would pause and I would think about a man who I met on the campaign trail early on, before people were just enthralled with Barack Obama. This is like in 2007, in early 2008, and he gave. We were in the elevator. He'd been operating the elevator for us the 3 days we were in Austin, Texas. And then the last day, he tried to give then Senator Obama a patch from his military uniform. And the senator didn't want to take it. And they went back and forth, and he finally took it. And I said to him, and the gentleman said, look, I've carried this with me for 40 years. I've never been without it since I was in the military, and I want you to have it. Well, I burst into tears. It was such an act of generosity, right? And so every day when I would go in through the White House, I would think about him. And I would say, do something today that makes his sacrifice, his generous spirit worthwhile. And it was a way of kind of grounding me through those tough times to say, this isn't about me. This is about serving that man. And I think, so he pinched me in a very unusual way. But then it's like going to Buckingham Palace, having lived in London and stood outside the wrought iron gate and watched the changing of the guards 100 times as a child, and even as a young adult when I went back there for school and college. And then being in a presidential motorcade and the gate opens up and we actually go in and meet the Queen. It's amazing. Or meeting the Dalai Lama and Dharamsala, or touring the pyramids with President Obama, or getting a big briefcase full of jewels from the King of Saudi Arabia, which of course we did not keep, but it's just there were just so many moments. But I think what I will treasure are just like the ordinary people who did extraordinary things and who held us accountable in a very important way. And that's why I'm so passionate about our democracy, because having been in the most powerful building in the world, to have the opportunity to work there, but yet see how closely we listened to the people who had the quiet voices, the people who disagreed with us. Even when they were disagreeable, we still listened.
One of my favorites in your book was when you met, as you can see, there's a 23 jersey. There's a long story behind that, but Michael Jordan was one of my, and one of yours. And so you mentioned calling him about receiving a presidential medal, and that must have been fun as a Chicagoan.
That was so much fun. In fact, I remember it was one of the most fun things was to work on the Medal of Freedom. It's the highest civilian award that a president can give. It's totally in the president's discretion. You don't need Congress. You don't need any approvals. You can just do what you want. And one of my tasks once President Obama made a decision was to call the recipients and let them know. And so calling Michael was just a thrill. And I remember I called Meryl Streep from Air Force One. And she did not believe that this was actually a call from Air Force One or that it was Valerie. And I had to remind her. I said, we were at a dinner together and I described to her something that happened at the dinner. And so then it was like silence. And then she said, you're serious, aren't you? It was just so much fun to be able to offer joy to people who have contributed mightily to our country and to the world, all in their own unique ways. So yes, that was very cool too.
Now, there's so many people who are watching right now who want to lead and make an impact like you have. What would your top 3 pieces of advice be?
Just start. Start local. Start with something that you care passionately about. It can be volunteering at a local high school, tutoring kids, or it could be organizing a block club, or it could be serving on an outside board or joining government. It doesn't really matter where you start. Just start. And you alluded to this a little bit earlier, Modupe, which is build relationships with people. First of all, it's the elixir of life. And so it's worth the investment. Be willing to be vulnerable and listen to your own voice and be open with people and honest, I think, and frank. And in so doing, you'll discover what your true north is. Mm-hmm. And it might vary from chapter to chapter of your life to some degree, but mostly, I mean, my true north has been service, not politics, but service.
Yeah.
And if you discover what that passionate is, it can, I guess what I'm saying, it's not that it varies, but how it manifests itself may vary depending on the chapter. Like right now, my service is through volunteer work. Mm-hmm. I'm not working in government, nor will I again, I don't think. But I love the work that I am doing. And so I would say, obviously, be open, be flexible, recognize that opportunity comes to not just those who work hard, but to those who are decent and that other people want to invest in and associate themselves with. I think so often we're so busy doing the job that we forget about the people. Right. And whatever job you're in, you're going to need people and goodwill. I think my next book might be titled Goodwill. I don't know if there's a more important lesson I've learned in life than goodwill. It matters.
That's great. You have spent so much time in the public sector. What do you think that the private sector can really learn from the public sector, and what does the public sector do so well that we really need to leverage that more?
That's a really good question. So I think until recently, the private sector tended to see their mission. Let's say about publicly held companies. The mission was return to shareholder. Quarterly returns, really important. There haven't been the incentives I think we need to think long-termism. And I mentioned that politicians often don't do that either. But what politicians are supposed to do, what leaders in the public sector are supposed to do is to take a look at more than just profit. And I think being a good corporate citizen is good for business too. I think that, and that's part of the wake up call that we've seen this summer among business leaders, is recognizing that if there is civil unrest, that's not good for business.
Yeah.
And how do they go about seeing their responsibility more broadly than shareholder return? So a few years ago, Larry Fink from BlackRock wrote a letter to his shareholders where he said, we have to care about the environment and diversity and a whole range of issues, and that I'm going to invest in companies that get that. Well, that was a real wake-up call. And then last summer of 2019, the Business Roundtable, the 200 largest companies in the United States, wrote a statement of purpose that said, we have to look beyond shareholder return to what's in the best interest of our workers, our suppliers, our customers, society.
Mm-hmm.
So we were seeing an evolution in the business community to what is supposed to be the mission of the public sector.
Yeah.
And I think that's healthy. Right now, I just read a survey that was conducted by Elman about 2 weeks ago, and it showed that people expect the business community to step up and have a voice in the racial justice movement. And the good thing about the younger generation is that you tend to buy according to your values. You want to work for companies that reflect your values. You want to buy goods and services from companies that reflect your values. And I think that's putting pressure on the business community as well.
Yeah.
They're taking great pride in their participation because they think it's good for business.
Yeah.
So morphing beyond shareholder return, recognizing your role as corporate citizens, stepping up to the responsibility, and speaking where there's often a void or where it's controversial. I remember Indiana passed a law that allowed discrimination against the LGBTQ community. And business leaders like Mark Benioff from Salesforce said, well, I'm not going to do business in Indiana then. And he got some blowback, but you know what? On balance, it was the right thing to do. And I think I'm encouraging business leaders to use their voices and use their power to participate more actively in our democracy, something that has traditionally been left to the public sector.
Yes, that makes absolute sense. And there were so many other things in your leadership that were so remarkable, whether it was repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell and other things like that. And even just from you sharing with us all your background, it's clear that you've done remarkable things along the way and that you found the area for you. But my one question for you is this, before we move it on to questions from the audience. We all have our own private thoughts and our own alter ego, the person we would have been if we didn't do kind of what we did now, the person who would do X or Y instead of being the Valerie Jarrett. What's your alter ego? What would that thing have been?
Well, it's interesting that you would ask, because there were certainly times in my life where I had fantasies about doing different things. But at this stage of my life, I want to be just who I am. I'm really comfortable in my own skin. I'm comfortable that at this chapter of my life, I wake up every morning with a clear set of purpose of what I care about. And it took me a long time to get to the point where I know the issues that I am so passionate about. And I get to spend my day doing just that. And that's a gift. It took a lot of hard work and sacrifice to get to where I am. But right now, I'm really happy with where I am. But if you'd asked me, like 40 years ago, I probably would have said I wanted to be Billie Jean King. I wanted to be like a world famous tennis player. That would have been ideal. And now she's a good friend of mine. I just saw her last week. So it's funny how you have these fantasies, and oftentimes fantasies that you have about people turn out to not be the reality. But with her, she's even better than I would have thought. But I grew up watching her play tennis, and not only play tennis, but break barriers and fight for equality and come out as being gay and take a whole lot of licking from people who were attacking her. And yet she's emerged as this extraordinarily iconic leader.
I love it. So we'd call you the greatest of all time. You'd be the tennis GOAT that we're hoping that Serena will win one more, but that we'll save for another conversation. So many questions have come, so let me share them.
Let's go with them.
How do you keep going in situations where you don't have control over the outcome and feel powerless?
Resilience. And we didn't talk about that today. And I'm surprised at myself because I actually think resilience is one of the most important skills that we all have to have. And, you know, if it doesn't work one way, try it another way. If it doesn't work that way, try it a different way. And you're right, oftentimes it is not, circumstances are beyond our control, but you have to just work at what you can control and influence. And sometimes it's more than you think.
Yeah.
You just have to keep at it. And I think that when I look back over what we accomplished in the White House, what I accomplished in local government in Chicago, what I accomplished in my real estate company, it's just do not give up. You just have to have this force of nature inside of you. And I think the resilience comes with experience, and it also comes with failure. I think one of the advantages of failing is that you realize, well, the world didn't come to an end. Right. And I'm not defined by that failure. And I talk about this a lot in my book. I was just miserable practicing law, and I wasn't even really good at it in the private sector. I found my skill when I was advocating on behalf of the citizens of Chicago. That I worked hard at, that I cared about in a way that I just didn't in the private practice. And you have to see what it's like to stumble and fall and then realize, oh, I can get back up. And I can stumble again and I can get back up. And hopefully I've learned from those stumbles. And so I stumble in different ways. So I think all of that helps you just continue to push forward in the face of circumstances that do seem beyond your control.
Resilience, bouncing back. Okay, next question. What steps can the corporate sector take to help the country heal after the presidential election?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. And I'm worried about that, actually. Regardless of the outcome, there's going to be a big chunk of our country that's really, really upset. Yeah. And I think, one of the many reasons why I'm supporting Joe Biden is that he has the ability to be a bridge. I mean, he's comfortable in his own skin, and he's also, look, he's a man who grew up, his dad lost his job. He knows what it's like to be in that kind of a situation. He's had more personal loss of loved ones than any one person should have to bear. And rather than letting it crumble him, his sense of purpose has helped him with his grief, I think. And I think that empathy and that experience, coupling experience and empathy and goodwill and resilience will make him able to lead our country. But it's going to take everyone. And I think the business community can play a very important role in this. Healing within your own company, talking to people who work with you, your team. There are microaggressions going on every single day, everywhere. That's just the nature, and recognizing that and doing your part to heal within the people you influence, I think will help our country heal. Yeah. And so I want a leader who wants to bring us together. That's kind of my political solution, but it doesn't change. The culture, as we talked about, doesn't change until we, the people, decide that it will. And I think business leaders have a powerful voice in that. And as I talked about fighting for the LGBTQ rights, I think the business community can do the same thing, fighting for racial justice.
Yes. This is a good one. If you're young, motivated, and want to get into government from Columbia Business School, what advice would you give? What do you think? Oh, and then there's also 2 questions. What do you think about running for office?
What do I think about you running for office or me running for office?
It wasn't a specific. Be specific in your questions, folks. Be specific. We'll do a little of both. Hey, how about that?
Well, if you're interested in public service, I say do it. Do it wherever you can. I started at the local level, and I have already explained to you why I thought that was beneficial. But just get in there and try to figure out how the government works. You have to educate yourself, and it isn't readily apparent from the outside always. You learn a lot more when you're on the inside. And maybe stick your toe in with a summer internship or a part-time involvement. But I encourage you to just start. In terms of running for office, I encourage all of y'all to run for office. I want people to put their hat in the arena and get in there and run. I am not going to run for office. Maybe 20 or 30 years ago, or even 10 years ago, I might have. But in this stage of my life, I don't want to do the 24/7 that you really have to be committed to doing for the people. I have a grandson now. I have all the flexibility in the world. As I mentioned, get up every day and do what I want to do. But if you decide to run for office, I would be happy to help you. And I spent a lot of time coaching my young mentees, who many have now grown up and are my former field organizer in Iowa in 2007, went on to work with me. He was my chief of staff in the White House, and now he's running the transition for Vice President Biden. He's all grown up, and I knew him when he just finished Yale. So I take great pride in mentoring young people, and so if y'all want to run for office, I'll help you.
What is your leadership Achilles heel, and how do you work to overcome it or not?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question. It used to be trying to do too much myself. And not because I'm micromanaging, but just it's easier to just do it myself. And I thought it was a way of being responsible. And part of leadership is recognizing the importance of delegating and giving your team responsibility. And I think by the time I got to the White House, I prided myself in, for example, there was a meeting with the president. I can count on one hand the number of times I presented to him. I let my team do it. Number one, because I knew they would work harder getting ready for it if they knew that they had to present to him. But also it was a way of showing them that I had confidence in what they were going to do, that I didn't have to do it myself. And so letting go of that temptation to try to do it all myself. When I first was Commissioner of Planning and Development, having had been in the mayor's office before and seeing how frustrated citizens were with government, they'd show up on my doorstep. I talked about this in my book too. And my job, they'd show up, not on my doorstep, they show up on the mayor's doorstep. And my job was to be the consolation prize, to go out there and try to solve their problem. Well, they didn't want to talk to me. And so I had to work hard to kind of, win them over. And I decided when I became the commissioner that I was going to answer every piece of mail. I was going to return every single phone call. I was going to be responsive. And 3 months into my job, I hadn't really gotten anything done, except I had been responsive. And I hired a chief of staff, and she said, "You're done reading your mail. I'll decide which phone calls you return." And at first I found that really uncomfortable, but I had to trust her. And she was right. I was not using my time as wisely as I should. And having been that person for President Obama, I realized that the higher you go, the more precious the commodity of your time is. And you need to have people around you who will use it most efficiently. So don't try to do everything yourself. Delegate to people in whom you have confidence and let them do their jobs.
One of the reasons I'm smiling so widely is that my colleagues and I have done some research highlighting that women don't delegate as much as men. And there's a lot behind it and more anxiety and all that. And so the fact that you just mentioned that really is a reminder of how important it is for us to delegate more.
Absolutely.
I want to ask you a question from Ben Milakovsky, who is a CBS grad who actually introduced us and helped to make this happen. And he says, or he asks, career switching is an uphill battle as employers tend to rely on traditional feeders. For those who want to move into a new role that doesn't have an obvious pathway, what advice do you have? Public sector or private or other way around?
Doesn't matter. Either way, I think what you have to do is help your potential employer translate your skills. And we encountered this, for example, we have a big initiative to try to get those who are coming back from the military jobs in this country. And we went to the private sector and we said, we have this incredible talent base coming home, hire them.
Yeah.
But then we realized that they weren't sure, well, what does the military have to do with my business? Well, maybe it's logistics, maybe it's intelligence, maybe it's, we have to help translate. And so if you're the one that's trying to make the swerve, you have to convince the person that what you've done will help prepare you. And I believe I've spent now half my life in the private, half my life in the public sector, and each one benefited from the prior experience. And you have to make that clear. When I interviewed Michelle Obama, back when she was Michelle Robinson, when I was working in the mayor's office, I said, "Why do you want to leave your law firm?" And she told me that both her dad and her best friend had died in the last year. And she wanted to lead a purposeful life and didn't believe that the law firm was leading her in that direction. Well, she had me with, you didn't believe the law firm was leading, because I had had the same experience. But what I remember nearly 30 years later was that she opened up and told me this story that had caused her to want to make the shift. So you have to help people make it logical and explain. You have to sell yourself. And I think the good news here is that compared to my generation, and certainly compared to my parents' generation, your generation is swerving a lot more. People are going in and out of the private to the public sector. They're changing course. My daughter practiced law for 6 years at a law firm, which I can't believe. She swerved and went into journalism, and now she's anchoring the early morning show on CNN. And so what it meant is that her boss had to have a receptive ear.
Yes.
Right? And sometimes you can help people, but I said to her when she was interviewing, and she wanted to work in local news in Chicago. She couldn't get a job because no one there had the insight to say, "You're a lawyer. How can you go into journalism? You don't have a journalism background." But at CNN, they said, "Okay, you're used to being on your feet. You're a litigator. You're talking to juries. You're talking to ordinary people, making complicated, litigation simple enough for them to grasp. That's the same thing as being on TV."
And look at
So it's a two-way street. It has to be someone who's receptive to that and recognizes, oh, well, this might be someone who actually brings a novel approach. And if they aren't receptive, then that's probably not where you want to go.
All right, well, I want to end with some quick fire questions for you. Which do you prefer, cats or dogs?
Dogs, hands down.
Pie or cake?
Pie, if it's the right kind of pie.
Kindle or paperback?
Paperback.
Gladys Knight or Patti LaBelle?
I watched their the other night. It was unbelievably good. But because I was in law school, we did a talent show, and I sang Midnight Train to Georgia as Gladys Knight. I got to go with Gladys.
And just a reminder, this is the Klion Forum at Columbia Business School. If you had to do it all over again, JD or MBA? Joint degree. One of my biggest regrets is not getting a joint degree. I didn't want to spend the extra year. How ridiculous does that sound now? Yes. Oh, Valerie, thank you so much for taking this time with us.
You're welcome.
This wonderful discussion as part of the Klion Forum. It really means a lot to us. And I also want to thank everyone who tuned in. I want to thank the Bernstein staff for putting this together, Ben Milakovsky, who connected us, the Student Leadership and Ethics Board. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. And I want to also just repeat a nugget that Valerie mentioned, that people are the elixir of life. So keep on meeting good people and keep on having that great elixir. Thank you all, and thank you again, Valerie.
Thank you, Modupe. I really enjoyed our conversation. Be well, everybody. Stay safe.
You too.